In America today, we seem to think nothing of keeping the Book of Virtues and the bridges of Madison County together on our coffee tables. We firmly believe that truth and morality are relative. We have replaced the moral question, what is good, with the pleasure question, what feels good. We have abandoned the idea that one set of laws applies to every human being, leaving only subjective, personal opinion. In the past, it was widely accepted that there exists an absolute truth that applies to every person, at all times, everywhere. These truths were reflected in the popular culture of the time, an era when moral absolutes were measured in terms of black and white, and in some cases shades of gray. Today, however, truth is viewed as simply an individual's opinion, a personal preference. The word truth means true for me, and nothing more. Since the 60s, we have been in the throes of a quiet but desperate revolution of thought, the death of truth.
If something's right, how can it be a waste of time?
There is no right or wrong. There is only opinion.
I believe that all of the rights and wrongs that we tend to believe in and focus on are what we've constructed.
I don't believe we can judge what is right and wrong.
What is right and wrong?
What's right and wrong?
Decide what's right for you. What's wrong?
Things are subjective. What's right for me might not be what's right for you.
They don't necessarily exist inherently in our society.
For each person, it's different.
I think it's important to be tolerant.
I don't think you should push your morality on others.
It's not our place to judge.
Tolerance.
Tolerance.
Close-minded.
Tolerance.
We should be tolerant.
I listen to my heart. It's never wrong.
When truth dies, ethics becomes relative, and right and wrong is decided by the individual. The death of truth in our society has created a moral decay in which every debate ends with the question, who are you to say? Because of the constant barrage of attacks against truth, it is important to understand not only where these ideas originate, but also to be able to defend the concept of absolute truth against the fallacy of moral relativism. Frank Beckwith, a professor at Trinity International University, and Greg Kokel, who hosts a weekly radio broadcast, Stand to Reason, have written a book entitled Relativism, Feet Planted Firmly in Midair, which addresses the issue of relativism. In it, they examine the different kinds of moral relativism and look at ways to respond to each.
Moral relativism is the belief that ethics, morality, are simply reducible to either the culture or an individual. That is, there are no absolute or universal moral standards that apply to every person in every place and in every time. That we are simply stuck with our own individual moral preferences that may be manifested in our individual culture, but nothing applies universally.
Moral relativism is a kind of subjectivism, which means that when it comes to moral rules, moral dictates, that which is right and wrong, ethically speaking, it's up to the subject, up to the individual to decide. There are no moral rules that are outside the subject, that are objective features of the world that we discover. Rather, the concepts of right and wrong are what individuals make up and invent for themselves. It's a personal choice when it comes to morality.
I believe people advocate moral relativism for many reasons. One particular reason, or one motivation I think is quite noble, that they want to get along with other people, and they think, look, if I go around thinking that I'm right and other people are wrong, I'm not going to get along with these other people, so I'm just going to pretend or actually affirm that nobody's really right or wrong. Now, of course, you're sort of kidding yourself, because along comes the moral objectivist who says, oh, I'm a moral objectivist, and I believe that certain people are right and wrong, and that person now has to say if the objectivist is wrong, and he can't get along with the objectivist. So it turns out that this person is as exclusive and narrow and dogmatic as the people he doesn't like. So it seems sort of inescapable that if you hold the position of relativism, even if your motivation is to get along with people, you're not going to get along with everybody. Secondly, the moral relativist who has a noble motive doesn't realize that his noble motives or motive presupposes a number of moral doctrines. For instance, the person who says, I want to be a relativist because I want to get along with others, assumes that it's good to get along with others. Well, is that a morally objective norm that people ought to try to live by? Of course. We ought to get along with others. Tolerance on a certain level is a moral value. And why would I want to get along with other people? Well, perhaps they may know something that I don't know. Perhaps they have the truth. You see, behind the motivation for relativism, I think the good motivation for relativism is this notion of getting along with others and learning from others, which I think presupposes objective moral norms. So I think why be a relativist then? Abandon relativism, because the whole grounding for your embracing relativism turns out to be non-relativist.
Turns out that in our minds, when we really talk about it, tolerance turns out to be an objective moral rule along with justice and fairness, and this is why we can have moral conversations and hopefully improve our morality, because we're trying to move closer to an objective standard of what's right. Now, here's the problem. All of those things which seem to make sense to us in our moral intuitions turn out to be meaningless concepts in relativism, because relativism robs those concepts of the moral standard that allows them to make any sense at all. So there is no moral rule that we ought to be just or ought to be tolerant. There is no good standard that we approach and get better at and improve our morality. And so there's no ground for moral discussion. And so the way this cashes out is, if moral relativism is really true, we're going to have to bite the bullet. And we're going to have to say that there is no such thing as justice. There is no such thing as fairness. There is no such thing as moral discourse. In fact, these terms are meaningless, ultimately. I can never say that another person has done something wrong. I can only say that I didn't prefer it, that I didn't happen to like it, that it didn't comport with my personal tastes. We could never say that we ought to be tolerant to someone else. The word tolerance is meaningless in moral relativism.
Another motivation, I think, may be more pernicious, and that is, sometimes people are motivated to be relativists because they want to engage in a certain lifestyle and behavior that they know objective morality would condemn them for. So they know that traditional religion, traditional views of the family condemn promiscuity, and they have no argument against it, so they simply say, well, let's just abandon morality altogether. Let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's get rid of it all, because I'll be able to live more consistently, or at least I think I can live more consistently if I abandon this traditional viewpoint. So I think that there's good and bad motivations for relativism.
Do we make up our own truth, or does truth already exist, regardless of how we feel about it? Are moral standards realities that are found in the external world, truths that we can discover, truths that cannot be changed by our internal feelings, or are they determined by our own preferences? A common view that many people hold to is the belief that all truth is subjective rather than objective.
It basically says that when it comes to moral questions, those questions of right and wrong, whether people are moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, the final standard is determined by what individual subjects decide. And so in moral relativism, it is not the case that moral rules are out there somewhere, that they are features of the universe, that they are objective realities in the world, kind of like math principles that we might discover, but rather they are personal preference items. They are the kinds of things that we choose because they resonate with our own self-interest or our own tastes, that kind of thing. And so there's a sense in which, although most people wouldn't put it this way, I think it boils down to this. There's a sense in which when morals are viewed as relative, they are viewed more like tastes in ice cream than something like medicines. Medicines you choose to cure an objective illness. And if you choose the wrong medicine, you'll suffer from the illness and maybe die. But when it comes to ice cream, you don't choose ice cream to solve an external problem. You choose ice cream to satisfy a personal taste. And so in the area of moral relativism, morals then turn out to be relative to the subject, and subjects choose their own moral system, their own values system, based on what appeals to them.
An objective claim is one that is true apart from my own mind. For example, that Ronald Reagan was president of the United States between 1981 and 1989 is true whether I believe it or not. It is objectively true. Now, objective doesn't mean publicly proved. It just means that it's something true apart from me. So let's say I know where a hidden treasure is. Now that may be something that nobody knows except me, but it's still, and it's not been publicly proved, but it's something that is objectively true, because if I were to die, that buried treasure would still be there, although nobody would actually know that it exists. So subjective truths refer to our feelings, our perceptions, those things that we can only know in a first-person context. Objective truths are truths that are true apart from whether I believe them or not, or whether I exist or not.
Relativists who don't believe in objective truth make moral judgments based on personal tastes. They voice their desires and then try to justify their choices with moral language. It's really nothing more than hidden self-interest. Yet they constantly mistake preference claims for moral claims.
A preference claim is one in which somebody makes a claim about what they like or dislike. If I say something like, I prefer vanilla ice cream, or I like vanilla ice cream, I am making, in that case, a preference claim. I'm not saying that vanilla ice cream is morally better than chocolate ice cream. I'm simply saying I prefer it. It'd be sort of silly if someone came up to me and said, you're wrong about that preference. They wouldn't even be in the right position to be able to know whether I was right or wrong, because I'm simply announcing to the world my preference. A moral claim, on the other hand, is something that is prescriptive or normative. That is to say, it tells us how we ought to act or ought to be. So if I say it is wrong to kill persons without justification, I am not even concerned with the question of whether you like to kill persons or not. That's not the issue. The issue is whether it is right or wrong. And people often confuse the two. For example, in the debate over abortion, I've heard people argue this way. They'll say, if you don't like abortion, don't have one. Well, people who object to abortion don't object to it on the grounds that they don't like abortion. They may not like abortion, but that's not the ground on which they oppose abortion. They oppose abortion because it's something they think it ought not to be done. In fact, imagine if I were to say, you know, you ought not to torture people, and you responded by saying, but I like to torture people. That would have no bearing. In fact, the fact that you like it and just simply is a interesting fact about you, which shows that maybe you're more deeply immoral than we'd ever suspected. But it has no bearing on whether the normative claim is true or not. It has no bearing at all.
There's a difference between preferring something and thinking a thing is morally wrong. Now, if there are no moral rules at all, of course, all morality collapses to mere preferences. But when people like myself, who believe that moral rules are objective, make claims, we need to make it clear sometimes that we're not simply making a preference claim. I might say, for example, that homosexuality is immoral. Now, when I say that, I am not saying that I personally don't prefer it. I am saying something beyond that. It may be that I don't prefer it. In this case, I don't. It may be that the thing that's in question I prefer. I mean, frankly, I think some forms of pornography are appealing to my sinful nature, and it isn't a factor there that I don't prefer it in terms of my tastes. It's that I think it's wrong. And so when I say that pornography is wrong, I'm not talking about what I like and what I don't like. I'm talking about what is morally appropriate and what is morally appropriate and what isn't.
I was on a panel discussion many years ago in Nevada where this was a panel discussion on morality in the media, and I when it came to my turn to speak, I said, I'm here to represent the tempted, those who sometimes watch what they ought not to be watching. And the audience just didn't know how to handle this. And I clarified that by saying, look, sometimes I prefer things that are wrong. I said, so to say to me, well, you don't have to watch this if you don't like it, doesn't make any sense to me, because sometimes I don't want to watch it and I do like it. Part of the moral life is actually elevating your preferences so they can reach the standard of doing the right thing. To tell somebody, look, morality simply is what you prefer, is to advocate the morality of the sociopath. That's what the sociopath does. He does whatever he wants because he likes it. It's a dangerous thing to tell people.
Most people will run into three main types of moral relativism. The first kind, which Greg Koukl calls society does relativism, deals more with culture than morality. Many people think that moral relativism is true because cultures seem to differ in their basic moral values. They point to these differences and conclude that since each culture has a different morality, none can claim that its morality is the standard.
The first kind of moral relativism I think that a lot of students will run into in college is what I call society does relativism. It's also technically known as cultural relativism. Now this is the kind of thing you run into in an anthropology class, and the professor will point out habits or customs in other cultures that are morally repugnant to some in the West, but are morally acceptable in those cultures. Now, the basic thesis there is simply that different cultures have different moral values. And this is offered as an argument in favor of moral relativism. And it goes something like this. This culture thinks they're right, you think you're right in your Western culture, you both can't be right. So it turns out that morals really are cultural things, and everybody's morality is equal and the same, and nobody has a right to say that one morality is better than the other. Even if there are these big differences, I don't think the conclusion of moral relativism follows from the observation. How does it follow that because two cultures differ on a moral point of view, that nobody's correct? Therefore, all morals are relative. It doesn't follow at all. Just because at one time in our history we thought that the earth was flat, and another time we thought that it was round, and there were differences of opinion there, it doesn't mean that the earth suddenly was formless during that time. And so in this first type of relativism, which I say society does relativism, societies seem to do different things, morally speaking. No moral conclusion can follow from that. It's simply an observation of different points of view. That's all it is.
Everybody believes so many different things.
Everyone is different.
There's lots of things that you're not going to agree with.
People disagree about moral rules. All right, that's true. It's a great observation. I'm not sure what follows from that. It certainly doesn't follow that because people disagree, nobody's correct. That society does relativism, all coming back at you here in a different angle. People disagree. People disagree about a lot of matters of fact. But that doesn't make those matters of fact now simply relative facts instead of objective facts. People disagree about the nature of the atom, but the atom is a particular way. People disagree about the things in the universe or medical issues or legal issues, but it doesn't mean that there is no right answer, just in virtue of the disagreement alone.
Should we always do what our society tells us to do? Or are there times when it is right and just to go against society's code? In other words, just because something is legal, does that mean that it is good? The second type of moral relativism, society says relativism, has even more serious ramifications.
The second type of moral relativism enters into actual bona fide morality in that it's prescriptive. It tells what one ought to do. Given that morality is unique for each individual culture, the second kind says that we ought to do what society says we should do. Each culture is its own source of morality, so to speak. That's why I call it society says relativism. It's also called conventionalism. Those who are Trekkies are really know about the prime directive, which says you don't interfere with another culture's morality. Well, that's this view, basically. Of course, when you watch those TV shows, they violate that principle every single time, but at least that's what they're attempting to accomplish. The chief problem of it is that there can be nothing like an immoral society. If the society itself is the one who determines what's right and wrong, then everything that the society determines turns out to be moral just by definition. And what this does is it reduces morality to law, or moral statements to power. If you have a group of people that are strong enough to pass laws in any particular society, then those laws turn out to be just moral by definition. And this raises all kinds of other problems, of course. The problem of moral reform, you can't morally reform a society. It can't get better, it can only change. You can't have moral reformers in the society because in order to be a moral reformer, generally it's someone who stands up in society and says, what everybody is doing is wrong. But on this view, what everybody is doing has got to be right by definition, and guess who turns out to be wrong? The moral reformer. So somebody like a Martin Luther King or a Jesus or a Gandhi turn out to be immoral by definition on this view. And someone like a Corrie ten Boom, who rescued Jews in Holland during the war, would turn out to be immoral because she violated the dictates of the ruling culture.
What's true for me might not be true for you. We've all heard this statement. The final kind of moral relativism, I say relativism, says that everything is a private judgment call, that morality is purely personal.
In the third form, the subject in view is the individual. So instead of the culture being the deciding factor, it turns out the individual is the deciding factor. I call this I say relativism, also individual ethical relativism. And this is the kind of thing that's characterized by remarks like, who are you to push your morality on me? Moral rules are relative. I'm the one who decides for myself, that kind of thing. Who are you to say? And this is a very common form of morality that we see in our culture, the kind of thing we run into most often.
What's right for me might not be what's right for you.
Morals are personal and what's right for you.
In this form, as it turns out, and a lot of people don't realize this, if you hold to individual ethical relativism, there can't be any immoral individuals. Because the only way you could have an immoral individual is if an individual violates a common standard of morality. But in ethical relativism, there is no common standard of morality. Everyone does their own thing. And this is why it's clear that relativism doesn't really even turn out to be a morality, not a real morality. It's a reformation of what morality has classically been considered to be. And one point will make the case very clearly. What do you call a person who most consistently lives by the dictates of this alleged moral system? You have a moral system of treating your neighbor like yourself and loving your neighbor, and you have someone who is the hero of that, who lives it out most perfectly, and you have someone like a Mother Teresa. And you say, hey, not bad. What about moral relativism? What is the hero? What is the best that moral relativism can produce? What do you call a person who most consistently marches to the beat of his own moral drum and is totally unconcerned with other people's ideas of morality? Well, we have a name for that kind of person in our culture. It's a homicide detective's worst nightmare. It's a sociopath, a person with no conscience. Now, there's got to be something wrong with an alleged moral point of view that has a sociopath as its best expression.
If individual ethical relativism is true, if we make up moral standards, then how can any culture or individual be wrong? Ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, female circumcision in Africa, none of these actions could be condemned if this type of relativism were true. We may not personally prefer what they are doing, but how can we force our morality on them? And yet we do become angry at injustice. We speak out against acts of violence. Intuitively, we know that there is a difference between right and wrong, a difference between good and evil.
We have in our minds certain concepts that we think are actually valid. The notions of justice, for example, the notion of fairness, the notion of tolerance, that we really ought to tolerate people that have different points of view and respect them in spite of the differences. People commonly bring up the problem of evil as an argument against God. The fact that we have moral discussions at all and we try to determine what is the best course of action in any given situation. These are things that we do very naturally, and they seem to be, according to our moral intuitions, legitimate ways of talking about things. But as it turns out, if ethical relativism is really true, all of these things are complete nonsense, because every one of these things derives its meaning from its relationship to an outside standard of good or evil. For example, we talk about the unjust legal system. Well, that kind of presumes that legal systems ought to be just. that they ought to punish the guilty and not the innocent. But keep in mind, though, that little statement there turns out to be a moral rule that we don't think is a personal preference. We really treat it like something that's objectively real. Same thing with fairness. People ought to be fair. People ought to be tolerant. And when someone's not tolerant of another, we take exception with that. It bothers us. It bothers us because we think that there is a rule of tolerance that applies to every human being equally. And not only that, we can never complain about the problem of evil, because the problem of evil depends for its force on the fact that evil is out there somewhere as an objective feature of the universe, and that's a notion that moral relativism at its core rejects. And so we find ourselves in the unenviable position, if we're a relativist, of having to say at the same time that there is no such thing as evil, no such thing as wrongdoing, that there is no such thing as justice nor fairness, there's no moral obligation of tolerance, there's no sensibility to moral discourse, and there is no way to morally improve. Now, I don't know about you, but that's too big of a thing for me to swallow, because it seems to me that it just is the case that we ought to punish the guilty and not the innocent, that we ought to tolerate people that differ, and the like. These are serious problems with relativism.
We have moved from the modern era into the postmodern era. Modernism was characterized by moral relativism, but truth could still be found, even if it was primarily discovered through science, either through a microscope or a telescope. Today, however, postmodernists don't simply view morality as relative, but also truth itself. All knowledge is relative. The question is no longer, is it true? But is it relevant for me? The perspective that truth is relative is known as epistemological relativism.
Epistemology refers to how we know things, how answering those questions of knowledge. Epistemological relativism refers to a particular viewpoint that says there is no objective knowledge of the world, that we are all stuck with our own perspectives. That viewpoint is found in a campus or university movement known as political correctness, where people are told that they are simply stuck in their interpretive communities or their own cultural enclaves, their own racial or ethnic groups, and that the role of a university is to make sure that each group is represented fairly, but no one particular perspective can be said to be more right than any other. One main problem is that when you tell people, let's say that they are stuck within their own framework, that they can't simply break out of it or see things objectively, that, I think, permits people to rationalize their own prejudices and bigotries. I see the role of education as the opportunity for us to learn more things so we can sort of break out of our own parochial prejudices so that we can know the truth, which is sort of the traditional view of the university and college. Today people are being told that their parochialisms and their prejudices are okay. And I think that actually results in greater racism and ethnic intolerance, the very things, oddly enough, that the politically correct types want to eliminate. I don't think they realize that their ideology is fermenting that and creating more hostility along ethnic and racial lines.
We are in trouble. The images that greet us each night on the evening news only confirm it. A mother in South Carolina fastens her own children snugly into their safety belts and then sinks the car in the river so she can restore romantic interest with a man who doesn't want her kids. The leader of a national animal rights organization states that animals are the moral equivalent of humans. 70,000 elderly Americans were abandoned by family members in 1 year. How should we react to the rapid decline of morals in our country? In Part 2, we'll examine ways to respond to the growing problem of relativism. Let's begin Part 2 of our program by looking at some of the common phrases that people use to argue for their relativistic ideas. For instance, They question the authority of the moral objectivists by saying, "Who are you to say?" or "Who are you to judge?" When they ask these questions, they are not actually asking for an answer. They are asserting that you are not in a position to judge or speak to these issues.
One of the most frustrating responses to me is when people say, "Who are you to say?" because they've missed the point entirely. I don't expect people to believe my point of view just because I say it. I'm not speaking on my own authority. I'm trying to reason with them about moral rules. And so that's part of the response there is, it's not my authority. It's not like I'm the one who's in charge. I make the rules. You got to listen to me. That's not my point.
And you're sort of implying a statement. It would be like, who died and made you boss? We've all heard people say that to a bossy person. It's a rhetorical question, really making the assertion you have no right to judge. Now, of course, I think the claim or the proposition comes back on the person, because when they do that, they're judging you. So one way you can respond to it is, well, who are you to ask the question, who are you to judge? And you're telling them, look, you're in the same position that you're claiming I'm in. You're judging me. Secondly, I've responded to that in one context this way. I told this young lady who had asked me this question at a public discussion, I told her, look, I'm perfectly qualified to judge. I'm a rational adult who is aware of certain moral principles. I think I'm perfectly qualified to judge. Who else do you want to judge things? Dogs and cats? I mean, if human beings can't be the ones to make moral judgments, then who's left? In many ways, she's abdicating her responsibility. People who raise this question are abdicating their responsibility as human persons and actually saying, I want to behave and think like an animal. I don't want to pick up the baton from previous occupants of this planet and be a moral agent. I prefer to make no judgments whatsoever. But of course, as we know, that turned out to be just another judgment. I don't think you can escape it. It's the way God made us.
It's wrong to be closed-minded.
Open-mindedness.
It's not our place to judge. Have an open mind.
Open-mindedness.
The assumption is that if you come to a conclusion, you're not open-minded. Perhaps I am open-minded, and I looked at all the options theologically and philosophically, and I've come to a conclusion. What could possibly the person be asking? Are they or affirming? Are they saying that because I don't agree with them, I'm not open-minded? Geez, that sounds pretty close-minded. There's almost a paradox in people who come up to you and accuse you of not being open-minded simply on the basis that you've come to a different conclusion than them. I think the other problem with it is that the person who says that really can't be a relativist, because if you're an epistemological relativist, if you don't believe there's any such thing as truth, then there's really no reason why you ought to be open-minded. Open-mindedness implies this. You ought to always be open to the possibility that you can learn the truth. Now, if somebody says there's no such thing as truth, then why should I waste my time listening to other people with their subjective opinions? I've got mine, and that's my truth. Why should I listen to other people? There really is no reason to do so. So I agree that we ought to be open-minded, but open-mindedness is not in any way related to epistemological relativism. In fact, I would say that only if there's such a thing as the truth does open-mindedness make any sense at all.
Education is one of the main tools that relativists use to indoctrinate students with their ideology. By promoting values clarification, multiculturalism, and political correctness, educators have helped destroy the students' confidence in moral absolutes.
Values clarification is a theory of education that was first put forth in the mid-1960s and became quite big in the 70s and even early 80s. You don't find the term values clarification used that much anymore in educational curriculum, but the ideas behind values clarification are still there. It's a theory of moral education that essentially tells kids to understand and appreciate their own personal values, and that there are really no objective moral values, that we each are sort of stuck with our own perspectives, and we ought to learn to cherish and embrace them and to apply them.
The idea of values clarification is that each student is given a circumstance, a moral problem to solve, and he comes up with his own answer. My brother's children in Hawaii went through this course, and they were asked whether a man who killed his wife as an act of mercy because she was suffering from sickness should be tried. And my brother got real upset, and justifiably so. And when he confronted the teacher said, listen, we're not telling them what to do. We're not giving them the answers. We're morally neutral. We're leaving it up to them. And my brother's response was very insightful, I think. And it captures the problem here. He says, when you give my children the most difficult moral problems people can face in life, and then you tell them that there are no rules to guide them, that there is no morality to give insight to the circumstances, but instead that it's up to them, that's not neutral. That is a moral point of view called moral relativism. And that's the problem. There is no neutrality. Everybody has to take a position here. It might be that they take the position that they're not going to assign any moral values to a particular action, but that's not neutral. That's moral relativism.
Multiculturalism is a kind of loaded word because it can mean many things to many people. I define it in two ways. I think there's a form of multiculturalism which I call weak multiculturalism, and that simply means that part of education is reading and learning about diverse cultures around the world and looking at the accomplishments of those cultures. And whenever we find something that's good and true and beautiful in those cultures, we ought to celebrate that. We don't make the statement that all cultures are equal. In fact, what we say is that the weak multiculturalists would say that truth is out there. We ought to find it wherever it's found. The weak multiculturalists would say that truth is something that is not conditioned or contingent upon culture, that it's something that we can learn apart from different cultures. It may be that certain societies and cultures have found things that others haven't. I think the weak multiculturalist perspective is consistent with the theology and ethics of Scripture. The strong multiculturalist, however, tends to be a relativist. That is, he or she says all cultures are equal. It's wrong to say that one culture has accomplished more than any other. That's imperialism, and we shouldn't do that. If all cultures are equal, what do we do with things like Nazi culture, or cultures that, like Nazi culture, that engage in genocide and bizarre and immoral practices? We clearly don't believe that they're all equal. I don't think the multiculturalist, if he or she really thinks about it, really believes they're all equal. On some college campuses, there are speech codes that say that a student cannot make disparaging remarks about another student's religion, ethnicity, or gender. Now, on one level, I think as Christians, we can embrace a code that forbids harassing people. We don't want as Christians to live in a society in which certain citizens harass other citizens. On the other hand, though, these speech codes have been used in different universities to shut up legitimate discussion. For instance, there's in some campuses there's a code against disparaging remarks against sexual orientation. Now, let's say that I'm a Christian a person on a college campus, a student, and I don't dislike homosexuals. In fact, I may actually have had, friends who believe that they're gay. I think that they're wrong. I want them to come to Christ and change their lifestyle, but I don't dislike them or hate them. But I have an opinion, and my opinion is that the lifestyle is immoral. And I decide to, let's say, write an article in the school newspaper. And some campuses, that could get you expelled because it's making disparaging remarks about sexual orientation. So on the one hand, I think as Christians, we have to admit that it's okay to limit the behaviors of students on campus, that they ought to learn how to be civil with each other. But the use of the speech codes to silence an opinion that is unpopular among certain intellectuals is really a form of incivility and harassment itself. It's harassing Christians into believing or forcing them, using the coercive arm of a university, to force Christians to hold one view, namely the social liberal view.
One of the most effective methods relativists use to undermine the Christian message, especially in the media, is to engage in name-calling. Right-wing fundamentalists, anti-abortionists, homophobes. These names don't address the argument, rather they merely attack the person presenting the argument. Rather than focusing on the facts, relativists will attempt to win an argument through emotional intimidation.
I gave a talk on political correctness, and some young man in the audience raised his hand in the middle of my lecture, and he says, "You're homophobic." And I responded to him by saying, I said, "That's an odd thing to say about me, because you're implying that I'm afraid of homosexuals, and that's why I oppose the homosexual lifestyle." Now, of course, it may very well be that I am afraid of homosexuals, but it wouldn't follow from that in fact, my arguments are incorrect. I said, for example, let's say somebody who was an anti-war protester was discovered he was hemophobic, that is, afraid of bloodshed. Would therefore his arguments against any war should be dismissed because he happens to have a fear of bloodshed? It may be as a fear of bloodshed, and yet he may still have a good argument against war. They have nothing to do with each other. I said, in addition to that, if I'm suffering from a phobia, you standing up and making fun of me is hardly politically correct. I mean, after all, if I'm suffering from a phobia, I'm handicapped. And so by calling me homophobic, what you're doing amounts to making fun of the handicapped, and you're more politically incorrect than I am. And the audience laughed, and they got a kick out of it. And it's just, the problem in our society today is at least in terms of the way in which political liberals present themselves, is they will typically do this. They will say, we ought to be tolerant and engage in civil discourse, and then they'll say, unlike those self-righteous meanies. Well, wait a second. They will decry name-calling and engage in name-calling. And for some reason, they tend to get away with it. What happens sometimes is that you have people talk about civility, and what they really mean is everybody ought to agree with me, and those who disagree ought to shut up. That's what civility is to them.
If moral rules do exist, then we face the question, what is the best explanation for moral rules? One increasingly popular answer has been to appeal to evolution. Advocates of this view claim that the moral threads that make up the fabric of society are the product of natural selection.
They say, listen, you don't need God for morals. Morals are the kinds of things that just simply evolved. And they think that this is the case because they can observe monkeys giving bananas to each other, or withholding bananas and then experiencing the group's rejection and things like that. And they say, see, here's rudimentary moral behavior. Now, there are a couple of problems with this point of view with regards to morality. Keep in mind that what is attempted to be done here is that evolution is being invoked to explain what morality is. Well, in order to be successful, it's got to actually explain morality. And morality can't be reduced to mere behavior. All evolution can do is describe why we behaved in certain ways in the past. What it can't do is tell us why we ought to be good in the future. It can't prescribe behavior, it can just describe behavior. And you see, morality is not about description. It's about prescription. Morality is about what you and I ought to do in the future. And you see, no evolutionary explanation can speak to that issue. And therefore, evolution doesn't explain what it purports to explain. It can't explain morality.
One of the unfortunate aspects of our contemporary world is that people are told that their intuitions are merely prejudices. So let's say a student thinks it's obvious that certain things are morally wrong. For example, that it's wrong to torture children for fun. They may be told by a teacher, well, unless you can prove that like a scientific proposition, you have no right in holding it. And what they're not told is that moral beliefs are embraced for entirely different reasons than, let's say, scientific beliefs or beliefs about geography or geology or chemistry. The way we know about moral beliefs is that we discover them, and we discover them by reflecting on human nature. We discover them in Scripture, and sometimes they just are things that strike us as true. Think about when children play. children many times are not, but when they're very young, they're not taught about morality and ethics in any systematic way, and yet when they play, they'll say things like, "That's not fair." You know, one kid will cheat. They understand what fairness is. It's part of the way they're created. It's an intuition that God has placed in their hearts.
If morality can be reduced to chemical relationships in the genes, then love and hate, guilt and remorse, and even the virtues of kindness, faithfulness, and self-control can all be explained through chance genetic mutations and natural selection. Homosexual rights activists and proponents of same-sex marriage largely embrace philosophical naturalism as their worldview. God doesn't exist, or at least he's irrelevant. You determine the purpose for your life. And if you decide that purpose is pleasure, then you should be free to do as you please. So goes the argument for same-sex marriage. They believe that freedom is not the ability to do what is right, but to do what you want.
People say things like, it's just not fair that people can't marry whomever they want. That violates their liberty. It's really not a question of liberty, because liberty, when we talk about what freedom is, we have to ask the question, what is the nature of freedom? Is freedom simply license to do whatever I want, or does it mean the opportunity to do the right thing or to do the good? So the question in same-sex marriage is really this. What is the nature of human sexuality? If human beings are the sorts of beings that are made with a purpose, and that gender has a purpose to it, that is, that men and women are the foundation of society, and that is to say, when they are married, they create the first government, so to speak, and that first government consists in most cases of children, and from there the generations ensue. If in fact there is a unitive significance to marriage, then there really can be, in principle, no such thing as same-sex marriage, because technically gays could never really have sex, because sex really means a union between a man and a woman. So what you have here in this debate are two worldviews. One worldview that says all sexual unions are equal as long as everybody consents. The other view says that not all sexual unions are equal, that in fact some are better than others, because in the case of heterosexual monogamy, that has unitive significance and serves as a foundation for society. And without that, we can't expect to have a society in which children are nurtured and brought up in ways that would result in the benefit and good of society. Now, I understand there are people who disagree with that latter view, but I think that the way the debate is framed in the public square, it's framed between one view that believes in liberty and one view that believes in limiting people. Actually, both views limit people. The first view says that if you believe that men and women should be the exclusive members of a marriage, then you are narrow, intolerant, and bigoted, and you ought not to have your views figured in any way in the public square or reflected in any way in the law. Now, the other view says the same thing about the opposite about the same-sex marriage proponents. So what you've got here is a conflict about two views of human sexuality. The same-sex marriage proponents are sexual nihilists or sexual egalitarians. They don't believe sex has any intrinsic purpose. It's simply there as an instrumental good for people to achieve pleasure. The other side says pleasure is an aspect of sexuality, but it is not the only aspect of it. It ultimately has intrinsic value because it has unitive significance as the foundation of society. So both sides agree with liberty, and they both limit liberty. The same-sex marriage people limit the liberty of those who believe in traditional marriage, because they say your view cannot be reflected in law, and you have no right to do so. Those who believe in traditional marriage say you can't have same-sex marriage, it's impossible, so you cannot do it. Both sides limit liberty and both affirm liberty, but within the purview of their own worldviews. Use what I call counterintuitive examples to show people the silliness of same-sex marriage. Don't forget that the grounding of same-sex marriage is that adult human beings have a right to engage in any consensual practice that they want to. And if they want to call that marriage, that's their business. Now, of course, if that's all that marriage is simply two consenting adults choosing to live together and having a bank account in common, that means that there's no reason why we ought not to remove laws against incest. After all, why can't a mother and son, or father and son, or mother and daughter get married? Why can't an entire family of 5 marry each other if they're all consenting adults? On what ground could the same-sex marriage person or defender oppose that? And to even be more absurd, on what grounds could the same-sex marriage person oppose me marrying my pet? They can't say, well, dogs and humans shouldn't marry each other. I'd say, well, that's part of the old school of thinking. You're narrow-minded. You're a speciesist. There's all sorts of things that can be said in response to that. Now, of course, these are silly counterexamples. The reason why they're silly is because we recognize intuitively that marriage has a particular significance to it that makes it the case that not any union counts as marriage.
Should the state take a position when it comes to moral debates, such as same-sex marriage or abortion? Since we live in a diverse society, we are told that the state shouldn't be biased. Relativists claim that it is not fair for the state to pick sides, to judge one person's lifestyle as good and another's as bad. But the question is, can the state actually be neutral on such matters as same-sex marriages or abortion?
To say that somehow the state can remain neutral on issues like abortion is, I think, tremendously naive. Let me give you an illustration of this. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to address the board of trustees of a fairly well-known liberal arts college in Southern California, and I talked to the trustees about the issue of law, morality, and state neutrality. And at the end of my lecture, there was a gentleman in the audience, one of the members of the board, who raised his hand and said, Dr. Beckwith, I agree with much of what you're saying. However, I think on the issue of abortion, the state can remain neutral. In fact, it does remain neutral. It is neither forcing women to have abortions, and neither is it forcing women to not have abortions. So in that case, it is neutral. I responded to him by saying that, in fact, the state is not neutral, and I did this by going through a type of questioning process. I, in fact, joked with him and said, I'm going to be Socrates and you can be a character in one of Plato's dialogues. And so I asked him the question, why do you think pro-lifers oppose abortion? And he said, well, because they believe fetuses are human beings. So according to their viewpoint, it would make sense why they would want the state to prohibit abortion. He goes, oh, of course, I understand that. He said, but now the state permits abortion. Isn't the state then saying that fetuses are not human persons, that they don't belong to the members of to the membership of the human community? Because if they did belong as full-fledged members of the human community, then we ought to protect them, and the state ought to be in the process of doing so. He said, yes. And then I said, see, the state isn't neutral. The state is saying fetuses are not part of our moral community, and for that reason, we're not going to protect them from being harmed. And he looked at me and goes, geez, I never thought of it that way before. And that interaction made me think that most people have not really thought through the issue of state neutrality. They put it forth and they say it, but they haven't really thought through on specific issues. Same-sex marriage is another issue where state neutrality seems to be very difficult to maintain, if not impossible. Once the state says all sexual unions are equal, it is not neutral. It's making a claim about the nature of human sexuality. So by permitting same-sex marriage, or let's say polygamous same-sex marriage, or incestuous marriage, or some other bizarre union, they are in fact then treating all those unions as all equal in the eyes of the state. That's a position. It's actually a viewpoint that I think can be traced back to a philosophical position known as nominalism. And that's the view that there's no such thing as human nature or natures at all, that we simply name things. So nominalism comes from the word we use for name. And so instead of saying that entity over there has a human nature, we say, well, all these beings that kind of look alike, we'll just name them human, but there's really no human nature underneath that. The reason why that's an important point, and it's something that a lot of people don't think about because they don't like to think about philosophical issues, but if you give up the view that there's such a thing as a human nature, then you really can't oppose same-sex marriage on principled grounds. It's only because human beings have a certain nature with a certain purpose, and that purpose is manifested in different genders that when they meet in the union of marriage, they complement each other and serve the basis and the foundation of society. If you abandon any view of natures, then you can't say that anymore. And for that reason, I think ultimately behind same-sex marriage and even the pro-abortion movement and much of the relativism we find in society is a view of metaphysics, that is, ultimate things, a view of ultimate things, a worldview. We'll call it a worldview. The worldview is nominalism.
In the name of state neutrality, social philosophers in our legal culture have institutionalized their worldviews of social life and human nature. In Part 3 of this program, we will look at some of the ways you can effectively respond to moral relativism.